Well, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for those of you in Asia Pacific. My name is David Meltzer, and on behalf of the Global Satellite Coalition, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion looking at the various uses of satellite communications in a 5G world. By way of background, the Global Satellite Coalition is a coalition of the world's leading trade associations for the satellite industry, whether it's SIA covering the United States, North America, ASOA covering Europe, Middle East, Africa, AVIA and APSC covering the Asia Pacific region, Communications Alliance of Australia, and also ABRASA covering Brazil. And finally, the organization which I'm privileged to lead, which is GVF, is also a member of the Global Satellite Coalition. GVF is the world's only global satellite trade association with members from all continents except Antarctica, and we're working on that. And our members represent the entire satellite ecosystem. So it's my pleasure again to welcome you. This panel will look at the various applications of satellite communications in a 5G world. And we're fortunate to be joined by an excellent panel. Each of the panelists is really on the front line of developing products and services for the 5G world in communication and satellite networks. And let me start the introductions, and I'll start with introducing Jerry Collins. Jerry is the Director of Product Management in the Networks Division of Intelsat. And in this role, Jerry drives Intelsat's strategy to build new and enhanced connectivity services by combining the power of Intelsat's high throughput satellite fleet with the values of terrestrial communication networks. And in particular, Jerry has a focus on how satellite can augment the value proposition of 5G networks and satellite and services. Next, I'd like to introduce Alexander Gertz. Alexander is the Vice President, Segment Market Management, Fixed Data at SES Networks in Luxembourg. And Alexander has responsibility for shaping product and go-to-market strategies of the Fixed Data segment. Previously, Alexander was a Vice President, 5G Solutions, responsible for developing, articulating, and executing a profitable role for SES in emerging 5G ecosystem. And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce Dave Rubin. Dave is the Vice President in the International Division of Hughes Network Systems. Dave's responsibilities include global marketing of Hughes broadband products and services. And in this capacity, Dave develops Hughes market strategy, including product and service offerings, and is responsible for the strategic direction for the Hughes product offerings. So welcome all. So for those of you that were able to listen in on the panel that just preceded us, it was an excellent panel comprised of regulators from the United States and Canada, as well as a representative of the satellite industry and someone of the mobile industry. And we heard a lot about the regulatory aspects of 5G. And it was really a fascinating presentation, but I'd like to really get practical with each of you in terms of what roles do you see satellites playing in a 5G world? And we heard on the previous panel, and there's a lot has been said for those that follow the industry, that satellites bring unique characteristics. They're ubiquitous, they're highly reliable, they're broad coverage, they see, in some cases, 1/3 of the globe. And this is a natural extender of terrestrial networks to underserved areas. And so I'd like to hear from each of you on what role you see satellites, communication satellites, playing in filling the critical need to extend the 5G network to underserved areas. And one dimension of that is there a risk for 5G to widen the digital divide? If you can give some thought to that. So let me start, just for alphabetical purposes, I'll start with Jerry Collins. Jerry, you have a name starting with a C, so you get to go first. Jerry, what do you think about the role of satellite as a natural extender of terrestrial networks, and what, if anything, about the digital divide?
Well, I think thank you very much, David. Look, I think that is the role that we want to play. And I think it's also the role that the mobile industry is inviting us to play. I think a large number of people in the cellular industry have come to the realization as they've gone through 2G, 3G, 4G, that there is part of the market they're leaving behind. the places and the people that live in the slightly more difficult places to reach, and that's an opportunity, but in many ways also an obligation. So we see the mobile industry saying, look, with the tools we have today in our standards as we've gone through 2G, 3G, 4G, we don't have the tools to reach all the customers and all the use cases that we want. So it is reaching the people who live outside the terrestrial web. It is the people who spend their time moving and who spend their time possibly in aeroplanes, in ships, and in high mobility environments. These are the opportunities. And I think for the satellite industry, what is exciting is that, it wasn't the satellite industry that showed up in the 3GPP meetings and voted ourselves into 5G. It was actually the votes from the cellular industry who said, look, guys, come in. We need you. We need to address these markets. The solutions we've had up until now, which have been terrestrially based, haven't worked. We need to look at non-terrestrial, and you can help us. And then, of course, for the satellite industry, it means that we become a part of a different ecosystem. And your second point about the digital divide is another risk of, widening the digital divide. I don't think so, because actually what's happening here is that the cellular industry is saying, no, there is a part of the market we're leaving behind. There is that digital divide, and satellite can help us cover that and narrow it. And whether it's going to be satellite integrated into 5G or actually satellite integrated into forms of 4G or even other Gs, that's actually the big opportunity. We're going to create an ecosystem, which now is going to be an ecosystem much more developed and with many more tools to narrow that digital divide, whether it's in 5G, 4G, or again, any other G.
Thanks, Jerry. And Alexander, so Jerry paints a picture which I think is correct. It's perhaps in the regulatory world, you often hear about the battles for spectrum between mobile and satellite. But as Jerry painted the picture, it's very much a complementary role when we talk about the role of satellites extending the 5G network to underserved areas. Are you seeing it the same thing from SES's perspective? And what do you think about the question of, does this widen the digital divide, or is there a risk? What do you think, Alexander?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Yeah, we broadly second what Jerry just outlined. There's obviously a tremendous demand for data, for communications. We're seeing it in the current situation. Obviously, there's a tremendous drive towards digital transformation in all areas of the world. We're seeing a lot of demand for 4G, naturally leading into 5G, and indeed, as Jerry said, the observation from the cellular networks that they cannot cover everything terrestrially alone, and so we see very much a complementary role to help provide connectivity to access deployments locally everywhere in the world, and there's no excuse for underserved areas to remain. I would say, in terms of the digital divide, without satellite, there is definitely a risk of increasing the digital divide with 5G. With 5G, you may get a situation where some areas, especially the densely populated areas, have a much better access to much better communications capabilities, simply because they're closer to fiber, because they're closer to places where huge bandwidth is available. And with satellite, we can overcome that for the rest of the world as well. So we can help reduce that digital divide. But there is certainly a risk of that without satellite.
Thanks, Alexander. So, Dave, Alexander paints a slightly different picture. I guess I've certainly seen satellite as complementary to the terrestrial networks, noting the role satellite can play in perhaps narrowing the digital divide. And for those in the audience, I'm actually coming to you from an area less than 100 miles away from the White House in Washington, D.C. yet the only broadband provider I have 100 miles away from the White House is satellite delivered. So Hughes is one of the two major delivers of satellite broadband to the consumer in the United States. And so, Dave, I'm particularly interested in Hughes Network's perspective, and certainly EchoStar, on the role of satellite as a complementary player in extending 5G to underserved areas. And what's your perspective on the digital divide and the role satellite can play? Thanks.
Yeah, well, I definitely echo what Alexander and Jerry just said in terms of satellite being a complement to terrestrial. And the reason why it's a complement, well, just to be clear, if you can get fiber, I think we all agree fiber is just absolutely wonderful. But it's really expensive to lay fiber in rural and remote areas, and that's the role of satellite. It is more cost effective, particularly with the newer generation satellite technologies, geo high throughput. I think some of the NGSO constellations, low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, are bringing some really interesting economics to the ability for satellite to cost effectively bring broadband to rural and remote areas. So it is a complement. I echo with that, and I just want to emphasize it's also practical. It's cost effective. But when it comes to does 5G risk widening the divide? I'm going to agree with Alexander. I think unequivocally the answer is sure. Absolutely, there's a risk because people in urban areas have access to tremendous services, including broadband. With 5G, we're going to see millimeter wave deployments, which are going to bring hundreds of megabits, if not more, in terms of a wireless connection. And that's where it's so important that regulators, continue to work with mobile operators and drive mobile operators to bridge the digital divide and use the capabilities of satellite to bring broadband to areas that might otherwise be forgotten.
Thanks, and I think it was Jerry that mentioned platforms that move, whether we're talking planes and ships, trains, automobiles. And I want to start with Dave on this question. What role will satellite play for mobile communications, for automobiles, trains, ships, and planes? Not just enabling people to communicate with people as they're on the move, but certainly machines to communicate with other machines while one end is moving. And obviously these are cases where a wire is not feasible. So I would think satellite has a unique role to play with mobile platforms. And Dave, why don't you talk about that, and then I'd like to get the views of the other panelists.
Yeah, I think today already satellite is providing connectivity to airplanes and maritime vessels. I think that's already very well established. And our view is that the role of satellite in providing connectivity to mobile platforms is going to continue. I think when it comes to the era of 5G, I think the difference isn't so much that the modality of connecting. I think it's that the imperative of being connected is just going to increase in the era of 5G. So our view is we're going to need more connectivity to airplanes and maritime vessels. Personally, I'm not so sure about broadband to an automobile. That one I remain to be convinced on that. I'm not sure that needs to be. So I think in some the view from Hughes is satellite is already playing a critical role in connecting airplanes and maritime vessels and certain land mobile vehicles, and that will continue in the era of 5G.
Thanks. Alexander, what's your perspective for mobile platforms, particularly in the 5G world? What role, if any, can satellite play? And to pick up on one of Dave's points, is there a role for satellite with automobiles? Is it obviously real-time decision-making, avoiding that car coming right at you? That may not be for today. But what about downloading updates? Is that a role for satellite? Alexander.
Yeah, so there's clearly a natural role for satellite to play with maritime vessels, with airplanes, etc. And in fact, we already have a pretty good business with that that's been growing. It's obviously coping with the current situation, but there's the undercurrent is the continuous demand of consumers to be connected and to be connected on the move in the same way or similar way as they are used to it at home. So that's a very powerful driver. And we expect that in the long term that will continue. With respect to specifics on the sort of on land, there are a certain number of niches, and I think they refer to that in the land mobile area, government or government related, that definitely are very promising and in fact established already. With respect to large scale sort of consumer automobile and autonomous driving from any satellite system, and that's probably a little bit far-fetched at this point. And indeed, autonomous driving is about autonomous driving and not about remotely controlled driving. So you wouldn't want to rely on any external connectivity for the autonomous decisions to be taken. It doesn't preclude updates, software updates, and any sort of information updates to be provided. That for the foreseeable future is probably going to remain a somewhat niche market for satellite that is, partially served through, for instance, fixed broadband via satellite with a Wi-Fi network around the house or something like that to support such a thing. But directly to the car and software updates while you're driving, that's probably a tricky thing anyway.
Got it. Jerry, and any views on from your perspective, Intelsat's perspective on 5G and mobile networks? Intelsat just recently announced an interesting pending acquisition of GoGo, which is obviously a provider of in-flight connectivity. So, Jerry, what's Intelsat's perspective on satellites providing connectivity to mobile platforms in a 5G world?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're absolutely correct. We've recently announced a pending acquisition of GoGo Commercial Aviation. So it's obviously a vote of confidence in that market and a vote of confidence that times will return when we'll be back on planes and able to avail of communication and broadband connectivity in planes as well as in ships, etc. So for us, it's obviously a vote that we see that as a big growth market. We see it as a market that will come back despite the current situation. I think the point probably to add to, rather than repeat her, but just to add to my colleagues' comments, is that I think when you see these moving platforms, they are things. They are things that are, as we go through time, are more and more driven by software. They are more and more driven by in terms of the analytics of what they are. Sorry, just give me a second. Sorry. As they're moving things.
We've all experienced work from home.
You orchestrated this, certainly.
Yeah, I wish I had. So there are things which more and more are driven by software and that require very, very detailed analytics. And we see a significant role for satellite in both the delivery of software updates using the value of multicast, and also for treating them as things which require analytics and updates to the performance, etc. So we see a number of different use cases in the mobility environment.
By the way,
we're starting to get questions.
Let me just add one use case that I neglected to mention, which I think maybe Alexander touched on. It's fleet management. That's more maybe getting close to IoT, but we see trucking companies and other companies tracking assets with L-band and S-band satellite solutions. Just thought I'd throw that in.
No, that's an excellent point. I started to say we're starting to get questions from the audience, and I would encourage audience members who have questions to utilize the chat function. The first question, and I'm going to throw this initially to Alexander and then ask others if they want to respond as well. The first question notes the physical limitation of satellite communications, which is latency. Sitting thousands of miles up in space, geostationary orbit, it takes a while, in maybe 600 milliseconds, give or take, for the signal to go up and back. And for certain applications, that's an issue. Alexander works with SES, which among our panelists is, I think, the only non-geostationary operator with its middle Earth orbit system. Alexander, what's your perspective on the issue of latency in a 5G world? Is it, both for GEO, MEO, and talk about LEO as well, is it a deal killer? What applications are so sensitive to latency that satellite is just not a viable option in a 5G world? Or is the whole issue of latency overblown in your perspective?
That's a great word that's a great word to to latch on to. I wouldn't say overblown. Latency, propagation delay. Propagation delay in the case of satellite is a given, whether it's LEO, MEO, or GEO, or even MEO. Obviously, when you have an alternative that has lower latency at similar cost or lower cost, you would take that one. Some applications are extremely latency sensitive. Not all applications. What we're seeing with the non-GEO versus the GEO is that the customers certainly appreciate the lower latency, but that many of them work very well with geostationary as well. There is a trend towards lower latency. There's an interesting trend that actually provides that, despite the longer propagation delay of satellite systems, and that's where you see the trend towards, on the one hand, cloud networking, and on the other hand, the trend, which is in a way a bit in the opposite direction, towards the edge. So actually what you see is that the satellite can be in between the cloud and the edge, with the edge very close to the end user, providing response time for very specific low latency activities, and therefore providing the best trade-off. So I would say it is certainly an issue to take into account. It is definitely not a killer for the role of satellite in any communications, whether it's with 4G, 5G, or whatever, as the last mile. So we're relatively comfortable with that overall from what we're seeing. So
if you don't mind my throwing in just a
yes, go ahead, Dave.
I think part of the question is, gee, how is satellite going to be able to answer 1 millisecond latency? I'm not sure fiber is going to be able to answer 1 millisecond latency. So, I think Alexander is talking about edge computing. That's where 1 millisecond is going to be served. you've got to do it at the edge. And so I think, satellite can be effective in providing 1 millisecond latency when it's assisted by the edge.
That's right.
Excellent point.
Yeah.
And for the benefit of the audience, Hughes is an investor in OneWeb, so it certainly sees LEO systems as an opportunity. And obviously, again, the physics, LEO, low Earth orbiting systems, have lower latency. The signal doesn't have to travel quite so far as it does with other GEO and MEO. Jerry, anything you want to add on this question about latency?
Look, I think the combination of satellite with edge technology is I wouldn't like to use the word killer, but it's the big opportunity for satellite. I think, I always say to my colleagues, our satellite network is able to enable more edges than anybody else's network in the world. We reach more edges. And when you've got, technology such as virtualization, which allows you to put functions right at the edge, and you can put storage and you can put applications at the edge. And if you're able to reach those edges, you can do more at those edges. This then becomes really exciting for satellite. And I think economics start to improve when you introduce intelligence to the edge, especially when you're trying to connect to people who are at the other side of the digital divide. So we're pretty excited about the combination of our global satellite network with edge compute technology.
Thanks, Jerry. So I think the view of the panel is perhaps the issue of latency maybe a bit overblown. There are solutions out there for those applications, for many of those applications that are very sensitive to latency issues. Another question we've received from the audience has to do with the issue of complementarity between terrestrial and satellite, and the flip side of competitive. And someone is asking, the question is, can satellite be another provider even to urban consumers or customers? Particularly the question asks about LEOs. What's the view, and I'll start with Jerry, what's the view on the ability of satellite to be, if not a pure competitor, but is there a competitive role with terrestrial networks for satellite in urban environments or other settings? Jerry, you want to take that on first?
Yeah, look, I'm with David. If you can get the fiber, go for it. This is not about competition. if as a satellite industry we compete against the terrestrial and the cellular worlds, we lose big time. We are a complementary service. We add value by being there in addition to reach the more difficult areas, to provide that value, and also to offer an alternative. One of the technologies that we're excited about is SD-WAN, where you see multiple access technologies being combined to deliver a higher reliability or a greater throughput or some critical services. That's not about satellite competing against anything else. That's about satellite being there as a complementary service in addition, and really providing a lot of value in that way. If you go down the competition route, we're headed for disaster. Work with the terrestrial, work with the cellular, and then you'll really provide value. That's our view.
And if I may add, there's enough business outside fiber regions.
I'm sorry, Alexander, I was talking over you. My apologies. What did you say?
Yeah, sorry. I was saying, and if I may add to that, there's more than enough business outside fibered regions.
Very good. And Dave, same perspective, not a competitive relationship. Is that right?
Well, I think for practical reasons, and it goes back to what I was saying at the onset, which is, it's cost. I think the question referred to LEO services. LEO terminals require the ability to actively track multiple satellites. Those devices right now are quite expensive. And, from a practical point of view, fiber is going to be cheaper, and you're going to be getting more capacity at a lower cost.
Well put. We may be approaching the end of this panel, and I do want to ask a broad question to the panelists. And as I mentioned, this panel was immediately preceded by one looking at the regulatory aspects. To each of you, if you were king for a day, you're now king for a day, and congratulations on the promotion. What would you say to regulators as the member of the royal family? What would you, not command, but what would you ask of regulators as they look to develop a policy framework for a 5G world? You are all on the front lines of developing products and services in a 5G world for satellite. So I think you have a very good perspective on what you need from regulators around the world to promote the development of products and services. So I'm going to start with Dave, and then Alexander, and then Jerry. Look to you to conclude on at least this question. If we have more time, we'll ask additional questions. So Dave, you're king for the day.
Yeah, king for the day would be wonderful, but I would say two things. One is spectrum, and the second is universal service. When it comes to spectrum, it's extremely important for the satellite industry to be able to have retain access to the spectrum it has, to be able to provide services to the underserved and unserved areas. I think WRC 2019 was a great step in that direction. We want to see that maintained. And the second is regulators provide a key role in encouraging services to under and unserved areas, and that's got to be maintained.
Thank you, Your Highness. Okay, so now we have another king, Alexander.
Another day, another king. So I would add to the two elements of my predecessor, spectrum and universal service. The fact that regulators can really help, regulators in the broader sense, also institutions and government organizations, really help in fostering a collaborative sort of environment and atmosphere around all of the players in the ecosystem, terrestrial, satellite, vendors, etc., so that everybody gets enough spectrum and enough sort of business to help serve the end user applications. I think we've talked a lot about the complementarity that needs to be translated into such a collaborative atmosphere.
Okay, so adding the dimension of collaboration, that regulators should promote collaboration. I don't think you'll get any argument from any of the panelists or myself on that. Jerry, you're also king. What would you like to see from the regulators?
Okay, well, I think I'd probably like to look around in some of the other kingdoms and see what's the best practice and who's getting the best results, particularly in narrowing the digital divide, and get some ideas from those places and maybe implement them in my kingdom. And I think there's a couple of really good initiatives going on around the world that I'd like to adopt, which is the case where regulators are going to the mobile operators and saying, well, look, if you're not going to use your cellular spectrum in this particular area where there's like 5 million people are unconnected, and you don't think you get your return on investment, I've got a whole bunch of guys here at my door, and they think they can get a return on investment. It might be lower than the return on investment you get in your cities and your towns, but they'll take that. So why don't if you're not going to use it, why don't I give it to those guys? And maybe they can turn a business out of connecting the unconnected. And I think that would be something we see working in a number of places. And in some cases, maybe even the threat of it actually can accelerate the move on the behalf of some of the mobile operators, or even the mobile operators then might start to partner with the guys who are queuing up at the door. And you end up with some really good situations, which, again, I've seen in some other kingdoms, which I think I'd like to adopt.
All right. Well, thank you, Your Royal Highnesses. So what I heard was looking for the availability, certainly maintaining spectrum, including the efficient use of spectrum, to pick up on Jerry's point, developing policies to make sure that the divide is not widened, but in fact is narrowed to promote the provision of services to underserved areas. And finally, to Alexander's point, to foster collaboration. And I think those are all excellent points. I'm being told we have about 5 more minutes. Would encourage anyone in the audience who has any questions. Let's see if we can get to them. But a broad question to the three panelists. We've talked about extending the mobile network, the role of satellites, for mobile communications. Broadly speaking, what other roles? The Internet of Things, enabling machines to talk to machines in massive numbers, multicasting, broadcasting, the role of satellites in a 5G world to address natural disasters or national security, military purposes. An open-ended question that I'll start with Jerry to see for any of those applications, where do you see satellite playing in a 5G world?
Can I say all of them? But yeah, look, I think they're all good use cases. Look, I'll just maybe talk about one and maybe we can leave it at that. Our belief is that there's an awful lot of value in the multicasting capability of satellite. We look at how content and video in particular, and whether it's video on demand or live streaming is delivered today, and we see cellular and terrestrial networks using unicast, and we see that as an unscalable type of environment. And what our architecture, what we believe there is a future in for satellite is what we would call hybrid delivery, which is delivery to a certain point in the network via multicast. Again, using edge computing, so you're putting your edges out at various points in the network. You're either streaming the content from that edge, or you're storing popular content to the edge and then delivering it via unicast. So we believe that as the linear model of kind of video delivery starts to decline, that we will move to a hybrid model of delivery in which certain markets, not every market, but in certain markets, there will be a benefit to deliver to a certain point via unicast and then via unicast rather than the unicast end-to-end networks we see today. So that would be one that we're certainly very excited about.
Okay, so multicasting, satellite and broadcast, not dead, contrary to rumors, and so
exactly.
Very much, it's a great perspective. Alexander, you want to pick up on any of the other use cases, or does one particularly strike you as something satellite is going to be very adept in a 5G world?
Well, I would definitely sort of reinforce Jerry's point on the multicast broadcast. I think there's a proven case for satellite in that area currently for linear, but definitely evolution towards linear plus edge, etc. We have 380 million or so homes that we feed directly, indirectly with broadcast content, which is clearly demonstrate that there is an interest there and a proven business model. I guess so that's a natural and definite application for satellite that can be evolved and should be evolved to 5G as well. Will make the overall network solution and architecture much more scalable than anything that's being considered right now. So I would reinforce that point.
Thank you, Alexander. So Dave, you get the final word. What would you like the audience to know about satellites and 5G, particularly some of the other use cases?
Well, we've talked about a number of use cases. They're all applicable. I would just leave with just one last one that is, really core to Hughes, and that is that, satellite can be part of the 5G fabric. It's a network of networks, and I look at enhanced mobile broadband with our next generation satellite, the Jupiter 3, that's going to launch next year. We're going to be having service plans that are 100 megabits. So satellite can deliver a range of services, including enhanced mobile broadband. So I think we encourage operators and regulators to look at satellite as a key element within 5G.
All right. Well, I want to thank all of the panelists. I think we've talked a lot about the very excellent use cases for satellite in a 5G world, and I think a lot of the information that we've shared will dispel perhaps in some people's minds that communication satellites is my grandfather's technology. Not whatsoever. Higher speed, higher throughput, lower latency. It's all there, and it's at prices that are very much affordable to a number of stakeholders. So, gentlemen, I want to thank you all. I think this has been a really good panel, and I want to thank the organizers as well for giving an opportunity to the Global Satellite Coalition to host this panel. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, David.
Thank you.